Good evening, everybody. I'm Homi Bhabha, Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the launch of the second year of our Environment Forum. Last year's wide array of events included visits by Terry Tempest Williams, Jedediah Purdy, Roy Scranton, Timothy LeCain, Tia Miles, and it's an honor for us to have our colleague Naomi Oreskes to lead off this fall. Before Robin Kelsey introduces Professor Oreskes, I wanted to share a few thoughts on the series and its importance for us at the Mahindra Center. The forum is our attempt to establish platforms that deal with areas of study and public interest that do not fall within the remit of any one discipline, and that we cannot simply, in a facile way, designate as being interdisciplinary. The fine granularity of these problems often emerges in the spaces in between established bodies of knowledge. And this is something that we're very keen on fostering and exploring at the Humanities Center. These forms of interstitial knowledge that question the boundaries of several disciplinary configurations. And out of them emerge challenges where we've got to find a kind of montage of methods in order to gain some purchase or perspective. And the Environment Forum really helps us to do this. You have people who write in the first person about processes that are so much larger than any first-person narrative can ever contain. So there's this remarkable energy between specifying something that has not been named and putting around it several dynamics of knowledge, subjectification, questions of value, and so on. So it's this kind of interstitial area for which we really thank our conveners of the Environmental Forum. And I say this because it's been my growing sense of what we do here at the Environment Forum. Working with these interstitial spaces redefines the relationship between pedagogical interest and political action. So it's not simply that we're dealing with a certain way in which new knowledge is formed, but it restructures the articulation of education and practice and the form of political calculation and judgment. The study of the environment presents us with the challenge of having to secure a language of description that finds its network, its voice in a continually circulating network of dialogues. The dominant motif of these events has been the profound issue of the care of the planet, Sorge, a form of care that Heidegger, amongst others, has elaborated in Being and Time. Care as a form of ethical attention and vigilant interpretation is at the very core of the project of the humanities. And to the extent to which an ethic of care is fundamental to the survival of planetary life, the Environment Forum is at the core of the work of the Mahindra Center. I don't think that there has ever been a time which has made this whole question of care as an ethical, but also as a careful textual project more urgent or apparent. There is such a widespread carelessness of the lives of the people, a carelessness towards the planet, a carelessness towards truth, a carelessness towards interpretation, coupled in the last months with remarkable ecological and environmental crises. It's almost as if nature is standing up and saying, We cannot have this any longer. And in these crises, what becomes visible are the great deficits of planetary care, but also the great deficits of citizenly carefulness. And it is in that spirit that I'm very happy to welcome you to the launch event of the second year of the Environment Forum, and I want to thank my dear friends and colleagues Robin Kelsey and Ian Miller for helping us to build this argument. Thank you.
I'm Robin Kelsey, Dean of Arts and Humanities, and with Ian Miller, co-convener of the Environment Forum, the mission of which has just been articulated with unprecedented eloquence by Homi Bhabha. And I want to thank Homi for embracing the Environment Forum, for coming to these events, for thinking hard about this project, and for, on this occasion, such a brilliant articulation of what we are about. I also want to thank Steve Beal and Sarah Razor, who have done so much to bring this on. Yes. I'm convinced there's more than one Sarah Razor, but she always looks much the same. So this university, 391 years old and counting, has a motto that consists of a single word, veritas. Harvard presumably pursues many values, but the isolation in our motto of this one value, truth, implicitly acknowledges how easy it would be to muddy our own waters, to lose our sense of direction and purpose, to drift down some easier path. The Harvard motto, I think rightly understood, tacitly recognizes that the pursuit of truth requires grit and courage as well as curiosity. And no one at Harvard exemplifies this combination of qualities better than Naomi Oreskes. Professor of the History of Science at Harvard, as well as an affiliate of the Earth and Planetary Sciences, Professor Oreskes has, by virtue of her gritty and courageous pursuit of truth, become a crucial agent of our collective conscience. Along with her frequent co-author, Eric Conway, a historian at the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech, Professor Oreskes has clarified the state of our knowledge about human-induced climate change, exposed the hidden apparatus that obfuscates and misrepresents that knowledge, and has offered a bleak but all too sober assessment of where our carelessness, to use Homi's term, may lead our planet and ourselves. With respect to climate change, in other words, if we have any grasp of where things stand and the challenges we face, we owe it in no small part to Professor Oreskes. A holder of a BS degree from the Royal School of Mines. I did not know this actually before I started preparing this introduction. I found that an absolutely delightful piece of information. A holder of a BS degree from the Royal School of Mines, Imperial College of London, and a PhD from Stanford. Professor Oreskes is the author or co-author of several books, and a common thread running through them is an insistence on understanding how the production of knowledge and the contestation that that production entails actually happens. Along with other leading historians of science, she has countered a long-standing tendency to confuse the justification for scientific theories with the histories by which those theories have obtained their scientific standing. In her first book, The Rejection of Continental Drift, Theory and Method in American Earth Science, She argues convincingly that a significant portion of this confusion stems from an excessively monolithic understanding of the scientific method. Indeed, she demonstrates that American geoscientists were so resistant to the theory of continental drift precisely because it challenged the way that they went about their work. It's a wonderful piece of scholarship in the history of science. Working with Conway, Professor Oreskes produced the 2010 book, Merchants of Doubt, a phrase that has entered the lexicon of many of us, a book that demonstrated that a small number of scientists with strong ties to industry and to industry-friendly parts of our political establishment have over decades served to obscure scientific consensus and sow doubts in the populace at large about robust scientific inferences. The coterie of experts, scientists of high standing who have, however, no particular expertise in the matter in question, has time and again slowed political recognition of a range of dangerous practices from cigarette smoking to fossil fuel burning. And as we experience the onset of post-truth politics, Merchants of Doubt is more important than ever. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this segue is made this evening. More recently, Oreskes and Conway wrote The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, a work of speculative fiction that makes vivid the possible costs of our ongoing failure to address our climate problem. And I know Ian uses this in his teaching and his wonderful stories to tell about how generative it is. In addition to her books, Professor Oreskes has produced numerous articles both in scholarly journals and the popular press. She is a public intellectual of the most necessary kind, and she is here this evening to talk to us about giant power. A giant power herself. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you very much for that incredibly generous introduction. But as you can see, I'm not giant at all. But on the other hand, I did pick up some grit at the Royal School of Mines. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to see so many new faces. And also, it's great to be introduced as a poster child for interstitiality, because earlier in my career, I was just considered a problem. You know, deans didn't know where to put me. One dean once told me I had the strangest resume he'd ever seen. So it's actually incredibly gratifying to feel that, you know, the world has kind of come around to my vision. So thank you very much. I'm feeling very satisfied tonight. Of course, that's a bad thing. You should never feel self-satisfied. So with that, we get to work. So many of you are familiar with the comedian John Oliver. And some of you may have seen the routine he did a few months back where he got really vexed about the fact that many Americans don't accept the reality of climate change. And he noted that 1 in 4 Americans are skeptical, or is skeptical, about climate change. And he said, who gives a shit? That doesn't matter. You don't need people's opinion on a fact. You might as well have a poll asking which number is bigger, 5 or 15. Do owls exist? Or are there hats? Now, although I love John Oliver, unfortunately, as a historian, I have to acknowledge that there is, in fact, a long history of arguing about whether there are hats, so to speak, and of trying to persuade the American people that 5 actually might be a bigger number than 15. So just to give you one example out of my work on the history of climate change, Oliver was, of course, referring to climate change, and in particular, he has gone on several rants about the recent claim that many of us heard repeatedly during the last election, the claim that global warming had stopped in 1998. Now, these are the actual historic temperature records going back to 1880. But one thing we know is that you can actually get people to think about numbers in very different ways simply by the way you present them. So, for example, my colleague Steve Lewandowski did an extremely interesting experiment a few years ago. These are the global temperature data, again, going back to 1880. Plotted in this graph, showing a 5-year running mean. but he labeled it world agricultural output. And he asked people this, what is the trend since 1998? And they all answered that output continued to rise, which is the correct answer. But if you show them this graph, you get a very different answer. This is what we call the skeptics graph of global warming. If you show them this, people will tell you they don't know, or the temperatures didn't rise. So this presentation is used by many climate change skeptics and deniers to confuse people about what's actually happening with the numbers 5 and 15, or 1 and 2. Put more generally, we have ample evidence that it's actually pretty easy to get people arguing about whether or not there are hats. Now, how you get people to argue about the existence of hats is largely a social scientific question, but why people have done so, and for what purposes, I want to argue is primarily a question of history and culture. And so today, I want to talk about the new work I'm doing on the history of disinformation longue durée. And I was hoping David Armitage was here so that I could boast about doing longue durée history, but in any event. And to talk about it specifically in the relation to the question of the defense of free market capitalism in the United States, because it turns out that these two things are very closely related. So I'm going to talk to you today about a new project that I call Inventing the Magic of the Marketplace. We could also call it the long history of post-facticity. I'm particularly interested in post-facticity in the private sector. That is to say, I'm not that interested in the history of politicians lying. I think that's pretty familiar. But there's a different history that I think is extremely important of actors in the private sector, businessmen, PR, advertising companies, think tanks, who have been involved in this, it turns out, for a very long time. So some initial observations. This pattern of private sector disinformation is repeatedly linked to two key and interrelated aims. One is to stop or limit regulation of particular industries, such as electricity or tobacco. And the other is to protect the private sector from responsibility for external costs of their products, like air pollution, water pollution, climate change. But the defense of the private sector through propaganda and disinformation has repeatedly involved tropes of freedom and the American way of life, and has been repeatedly linked to the defense of laissez-faire capitalism in the early 20th century, or what we tend to call neoliberalism later. And the repeated argument that the American way of life is inextricably bound to enterprise capitalism. So this is a cultural question, and so that's one reason why I was keen to give this talk here tonight at the Humanities Center. Now, Robin already referred to my work with Eric Conway. In Merchants of Doubt, we showed how this argument about freedom and the American way of life was developed and honed by the tobacco industry, and then how a group of actors applied these arguments to a set of issues in the late 20th century, including acid rain, the ozone hole, the regulation of DDT, and, of course, climate change. We identified a specific strategy which we saw used repeatedly to cast doubt on facts that show the harms of your product, insist that the science is unsettled, to recruit experts to give your otherwise obviously self-interested position credibility, to impugn the motives of your opponents, and to assert that their actions threaten American freedom, hence the use of the term watermelons, that they're green on the outside but red on the inside. So in our research, we traced these arguments from current and recent debates about climate change back to the tobacco industry. And we showed through our research how the same think tanks, the same PR firms, the same advertising agencies, and sometimes even the same people were involved in attacking the science showing the harms of tobacco and the science showing the harms of fossil fuel combustion. And we showed how they linked the defense of harmful products to the defense of free market capitalism, and from there to the defense of freedom generally. So just to give one example, this is one of my favorite ones from a report defending the tobacco industry and attacking the science related to secondhand smoke. The scientist who wrote this piece, one of our Merchants of Doubt, actually laid it on the line, and he wrote, quote, "If we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there's essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives." So there's the argument in the nutshell, and people often ask me, well, are these people just shills for industry? How do they sleep at night? How do they understand what they're doing? I mean, it's a complicated story. The answer's not the same for everyone, but I think this argument helps to explain how people can take these positions and view them as principled. So, but although it may be principled for an individual, it gets used in an extremely unprincipled way. So I thought I would just show you a small clip from our film, from the film version of Merchants of Doubt, because I'm an extremely lucky academic. If you don't read my book, I can show you the movie. So I'm going to just show you a clip that really shows how this argument about freedom was exploited by the tobacco industry, and then we'll move on to looking at this longer, older history.
The tobacco companies knew you have to appeal to something more basic than this intellectual pursuit of science. And how do you do it? You do it with freedom.
That's the way freedom dies. Today it's smoking. But what will they try to regulate next?
What do they try to regulate next? What we can say? What we can read?
I don't want Big Brother breathing down my neck telling me what to do.
Not just for the smokers, but for non-smokers and all others in this country who want to live their lives making their own decisions, not having them made for them by the benevolent bureaucracy of Washington wisdom or these other folks.
By turning it into an abstract issue of freedom and moving it away from protecting their corporate interests, they can get people behind it. I mean, who could possibly be against freedom? And then what happened was these other companies and other industries realized, like, hey, this is a pretty good idea.
Everywhere you turn, somebody is telling us what we can't eat. Do you ever feel like you've always been told what not to do?
These are people that want to tell us where to work, how many children we can have, how much energy we can use, how much water we can have.
Looking at the global warming issue, you're seeing the same thing happening.
For literally decades, David Koch has been just a tireless defender of our economic and individual freedoms. I'd like to introduce to you David Koch, our chairman at the Americans for Prosperity.
Koch Industries is heavily invested in coal, oil, tar sands. They are some of the biggest polluters in the country, have received some of the largest fines.
They needed an army of people to fight against regulation in the name of freedom.
Good afternoon, fellow freedom fighters!
Okay, so you get the picture. So this is Americans for Prosperity, otherwise known as the Tea Party, and the motif, the repeated motif, is about freedom. So today what I want to talk about is my new work that begins to extend this analysis. And I want to say, you know, Eric Conway and I were pretty excited when we realized that we could trace climate change to now back to the tobacco industry. We thought that was like pretty amazing. And I should have realized as a historian that if you look deeper, though, you can always find earlier antecedents. So that's really what this work is today, to look at some even earlier antecedents. So I want to begin by talking about an advertising campaign from the 1960s that warned of a grave impending threat to American freedom. So one advertisement shown here asked the question, how is freedom lost? Another answered the question, freedom is not lost by guns alone. And you can see this is the Berlin Wall here being shown. Another ad asked, will you leave these freedoms to your children? And it identified 4 key freedoms, symbolized here by a Bible, a key, a pencil, and the ballot. The Bible representing, of course, freedom of religion. The key representing freedom, the right to privacy. The pencil representing the right to free speech and free expression. And the ballot representing the right to democratic governance. And this advertisement told us that half the world is trying to destroy these 4 symbols and what they stand for. So what were these advertisements for? Well, if you hadn't seen the title of my talk, you might think, or maybe you even still think, a political party, maybe Barry Goldwater, an anti-communist group, maybe the John Birch Society, maybe a campaign against the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, maybe an American church, but the answer is electricity. This was an advertising campaign defending electricity generated in the private sector against electricity generated in municipally owned utilities or federal power generation schemes. And the argument had two major components. The first was ostensibly a factual claim. It was the claim that government-run electricity was more expensive than private sector electricity. And therefore, it was not in the public interest to have publicly funded or publicly managed electricity projects. So, for example, this ad asked, how can we save taxpayers $500 million? The answer, don't build federal hydropower projects. This ad informed us that American families paid over $5 trillion a year to support public power. And at the bottom, it may be cut off there, but it said in capital letters, when public power wins, you lose. But the advertisement was also ideological. It wasn't just about the cost of federal hydroelectric dams or other things like that. It was also the argument that government-run electricity was a threat to American freedom and democracy. So again, if we go back to this ad, we already talked about the idea of these key freedoms, and some ads join these two themes together. So this is my favorite one. This one tells us that there are actually two kinds of electricity. You might not know that from your light bulb because you wouldn't be able to see the difference, but actually there's a big difference between electricity from an electric company versus electricity from the government. Company electricity is better than government electricity because it's cheaper, because it pays taxes rather than imposing them, because it's available to everyone without discrimination, and most importantly, because it plays a key role in America's free enterprise system. And I love this advertisement because the pretty woman represents the private sector, and this dumbfounded man represents the government. One interesting thing about these advertisements is that they inverted conventional notions of public and private, referring to privately held shareholder-owned companies as public, but putting public in scare quotes and claiming that public power wasn't actually public at all. It was government power. So there's a kind of jujitsu move here. The private sector is equated with the public, as in British public schools, but public power is asserted not actually to be in the hands of the public at all, but in an interfering, incompetent, and wasteful government. The key argument is that by interfering in the marketplace, the government is threatening our private property and personal freedom, as well as wasting our money. Now, these ads were from the 1960s, but the same argument had made before in the 1920s by an organization known as NELA, the National Electric Light Association. By the 1960s, many Americans had forgotten about this earlier campaign, but it essentially took the same form. Public power is more expensive. Public power is a threat to freedom. It's unsound, socialistic, and fundamentally un-American. And anyone who advocates it must be a socialist or worse. So who were NELA? NELA was a trade organization first established in the 1880s, but expanded and strengthened under the influence of the Chicago industrialist Thomas Insull, who was one of the leaders in the development of electrification of the city of Chicago. NELA represented the holding companies that in the late 19th and early 20th century owned most local private electricity utilities. In the 1930s, they were investigated by the Federal Trade Commission in a series of investigations that led to about 30 volumes of reports. The FTC found that NELA had organized a massive propaganda campaign designed to discredit municipal electricity and impugn the motives of those who supported it. They concluded that holding companies had in fact been engaged in many speculative financial activities and were a major source of political corruption. Now, in hindsight, many of these activities are actually very similar to the things for which the tobacco industry was prosecuted under the RICO statutes, but RICO had not yet been passed as a law. So they couldn't be prosecuted for most of these activities. There was no law that made these things illegal, but they were greatly constrained after 1935 by the passage of the Holding Company Act, which, interestingly enough, was repealed in 2005. Now, in hindsight, historians who have studied this episode have concluded that the central claims that NELA put forward were factually untrue, that in fact, private power was generally more costly, and that this was known and documented at the time, and that public power, when it was implemented under the New Deal and rural electrification and the Tennessee Valley Authority, well, the federal government did grow, but the United States did not become communistic, although some people might argue that point. So here's the interesting question. Why did the electricity industry think they needed this propaganda campaign? Well, there were three main issues that were motivating them. One was the problem of rural electrification. The second was the problem of what constituted a reasonable rate for electricity. And the third were these allegations of questionable practices. So as many of you probably know, power generation in the United States was mainly developed as a private sector activity, which contrasted to other countries like Germany, France, Japan, and New Zealand, where the government was much more involved. It was a huge success in urban areas like New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. The private sector was very effective in bringing electricity to citizens in major urban areas. But rural areas of America remained largely underserved, or in some cases completely unserved. And where they were served, they were often too expensive for rural citizens, particularly farmers, to afford. And the fact that it was too expensive for farmers became a topic of conversation because many people argued that, well, it was all very well and good to light up the Empire State Building or have lighting displays at the St. Louis World's Fair. It was farmers who really needed electricity for the hard work that they did on their farms. So in response to this lack of electricity in rural areas, some farmers developed cooperatives, and there was increasing pressure for the federal government to become involved in electricity. And indeed, there were a couple of major projects, such as the Muscle Shoals Project, which historians have written a lot about, the Hoover Dam, and ultimately the Tennessee Valley Authority and rural electrification, although that came later. The second was the issue of reasonable rates. Electricity was widely recognized as being what was known at that time as a natural monopoly, that is to say, an industry in which competition didn't really make sense because it would be wasteful and impractical to have multiple electricity lines running through a city or a rural area. So companies were given franchises that were regulated by state commissions on the same model as the railroads, which were also viewed as natural monopolies. The commissions would set what were known to be or thought to be reasonable and fair rates, and that was based on the idea of a reasonable rate of return, which was generally thought to be 5 to 6%. But there was considerable evidence that companies were overcharging and actually garnering returns of 7, 8, or 9%, in part by exaggerating their operating costs and using this to justify higher rates. In fact, there was evidence that public electricity was cheaper, and the prime case was Ontario hydropower. In Canada, Ontario had developed a system of hydropower that was publicly owned, and it had brought power to most residents of Ontario at much lower cost than across the border in New York City or Pennsylvania. So very similar cultural situation. Electricity was much more widely available in Ontario and cheaper than it was in upstate New York or Pennsylvania. And this was used as evidence that A, the industry was charging too much, and B, that public generation might be more cost effective. The third was this issue of questionable financial practices. The holding companies were accused of stock watering, issuing stock in excess of company value and using this to justify higher rates, of exaggerating their operating costs, of bribing local officials, and creating various unstable financial instruments, which in 1929 were argued to have contributed to the crash. So what was the solution to these three interrelated problems? Well, a number of people began to argue that the solution was for the government to become more involved in electricity markets. One I've already mentioned, the idea of federal electricity generation projects like Muscle Shoals and the Hoover Dam. And often these were proposed in conjunction with flood control and irrigation, which were broadly viewed as legitimate federal functions. There were also proposals for a federal regulatory system on the grounds that a federal system would not be as easily corrupted and influenced as a local one. Another argument, however, was a state-based response. And one of the most interesting ones at this time was something called Giant Power. This was a proposal to create a system of integrated statewide electrical power in Pennsylvania. Giant Power was not proposed by a group of radical communists or the International Workers of the World, but rather by Gifford Pinchot, the governor of Pennsylvania, who, as many of you know, was the first head of the U.S. Forest Service and a great advocate of rational management of natural resources. He worked in conjunction with Morris Llewellyn Cook, who was a mechanical engineer in the Taylorist tradition, so again, rational analysis of industry and marketing and manufacturing. And Cook later became the head of rural electrification in the New Deal under President Roosevelt. Both of these men were progressive Republicans, although Cook did later become a Democrat under Roosevelt. Both were advocates of progressive-era scientific management of industry and national resources, so they were progressives, but they were not radicals. So what was the idea? Giant power was proposed in 1923, and the idea was that you would build power plants right at coal mines, at the coal mouth as it was, and then you would feed that electricity into a statewide grid that would offer power to all residents of the state of Pennsylvania at fair and equitable rates. Private companies could still operate, but they would be forced into the statewide pool, and all citizens would be served power at the same rates. And the state would create a strong regulatory commission to oversee the project. Now, why was this needed? Well, I've already said fair pricing was one major issue, but the bigger issue really was access. So I've already talked about this. Gifford Pinchot was particularly interested in the problem of getting electricity to farmers who he felt really needed it. Indeed, at this point already, electricity was coming to be seen not as a luxury, but as a necessity, not as a privilege, but a right. And increasingly, it was also seen in a kind of utopian vision, a kind of technophilic utopian vision, as the foundation for improvement in the quality of the lives of the American people. So in 1925, for example, Pinchot wrote, "Giant power is a plan to bring cheaper and better electric service to all those who have it now, and to bring good and cheap electric service to those who are still without it. It is a plan by which most of the drudgery of human life can be taken from the shoulders of men and women who toil and replaced by the power of electricity." The industry considered this to be a huge threat. The electricity industry was growing rapidly and was highly profitable, and as I've already mentioned, was developed in the United States as a private sector activity. But there were competing models from other places, and the industry worried that the United States might actually squeeze out the private generator and replace it with a federally or state-controlled system. Giant power was drawing on these other models, and it did seek deliberately to, quote, change the direction of the utility industry, as the historian of technology Tom Hughes wrote many years ago. Industry opponents viewed it as an unfair taking, as socialistic, and a threat to freedom as well as a threat to their profits. So the Pennsylvania Electric Association wrote, quote, that's a typo, sorry. "The clear purpose of this plan is to take from any electric service system the benefits it has thus far accrued by reason of able management, successful financing, painstaking research work, and courage in the replacement of apparatus. Private initiative is to be supplanted by a political plan based on a socialistic theory and offering the possibilities of the construction of a statewide, all-powerful political machine." Now, the proponents here were invoking what the historian David Noble has called technological Darwinism, the argument that because the electricity had developed in a certain way to date, that this was necessarily the best way, and it was the result of the hard work and fitness of the able managers and smart financiers, smart investors who had done this. We could argue about whether or not those claims were true, but whether or not they were, one could certainly imagine a rational argument about the pros and cons of private and public sector systems, and a rational discussion of how to get electricity to rural customers who were not well served by the existing system. But that's not what happened. Instead, NELA launched a massive propaganda campaign to discredit Giant Power, to discredit Gifford Pinchot, and to discredit any form of publicly generated or distributed electrical power, whether on the municipal, state, or federal level. So what did they do? Well, according to the Federal Trade Commission, everything but skywriting. They targeted newspapers and other print media, supplying press releases, articles, editorials, many of which were written by third-party allies, that is to say, people who didn't appear to have a link to the electricity industry, but in fact were being paid. They attempted to influence radio, film, and theater. They launched attack on politicians like Pinchot, who supported Giant Power or other public projects, so similar to what we've seen the Americans for Prosperity do today. But really interestingly, particularly for us, with our motto of Veritas, their largest focus was actually us, the educational system, high school and higher education. And in particular, they focused on textbooks. NELA undertook a survey of all the existing high school and college texts that were being used in civics and economics classrooms. And then they began to pressure publishers, colleges and universities, and school districts and libraries to drop texts that they considered objectionable. So what made a textbook objectionable? Well, NELA claimed that the texts were not objective or that they were socialistic. But if we look at the documentary evidence, we begin to see that actually they objected to almost anything that cast industry in an unflattering light, or anything that suggested that there could be a place for publicly generated electricity. I think I'm going to kind of skip through some of the details about some of the things that they objected to. But here's a list of terms, so specific terms that NELA found objectionable in textbooks: overcapitalization, stock watering, abuses in rate making, weaknesses in regulatory practices, reasonable rates, fair return, or even the term public utility. So anything that suggested that there might be a problem, that the industry was less than completely honest or less than completely fair, or that even there was a concept of a fair return, all of these terms were considered objectionable. So what did they do? They began to target the authors of these textbooks and offered them money to write new editions of the books. And if they agreed to do it, which many did, because sure, who wouldn't want to update their textbook and be paid for it, right? Then, after they had agreed, then they sent them a list of suggestions for suggested changes. If the authors said no, they weren't interested, then they hired other authors to write alternative textbooks. And the consistent pattern and theme in these books was to promote the ideology of free market capitalism. And then once the textbooks were written, they sent free copies to schools, colleges, libraries across the country, and began to pressure schools to adopt them, arguing that the existing textbooks were biased and anti-American and socialistic, but the new textbook was fairer and more objective. They also funded academic studies in universities to prove that public power was more expensive than private. And once these studies were done, then they heavily promoted them to the press through press releases, bulletins, and funded lecture tours. So someone would agree to write a report that was favorable to the industry, then they would pay for them to go on a lecture tour around the country. And they worked to develop curricula at colleges and universities in America. And I am actually, in some written materials, I actually have a list of the universities that are involved, and it's really scary, and it includes Harvard. So they developed specific courses, in some cases whole curricula, in economics and business administration. And the purpose, in their own words, was, quote, to ensure straight economic thinking, by which they meant capitalistic, free market, laissez-faire principles, and to ensure the possession by young people and their teachers of, quote, correct information. And they even gave funding to establish departments in schools, one of which was the Harvard School of Business. So I can't wait to get into the archives to look at these materials. So what would constitute success in their view? Quote, when judges, lawmakers, members of public utility commissions, prosecuting attorneys, and engineers, in short, all public officials, will be so trained as automatically to oppose genuine regulation, public ownership, honest valuations, equitable rates, etc. When I read that paragraph, I couldn't help but think of this document from 1998, when the American Petroleum Institute issued a document that said, victory will be achieved when average citizens, quote, understand / recognize uncertainties in climate science, recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom, the media understands uncertainties in climate science, and if we go down to the bottom, those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of extant science appear to be out of touch with reality. Now, in all these activities, they often worked through, as I've already mentioned, third-party allies, other groups or other individuals, to try to hide or minimize the NELA connection. And particularly this was true when they funded academic studies. They would try to hide the funding, so a report would come out, but it would nowhere disclose that the report had been wholly funded by NELA. And this was obviously to make the studies appear independent and therefore objective and credible. The FTC concluded not just that this was a propaganda campaign, but that it was the largest peacetime propaganda campaign in US history. And academics had played a key role, especially academic administrators, many of whom had welcomed NELA help, enthusiastically accepting NELA funds to develop courses and departments. So Robin Kelsey, I'm looking at you. But I think we've all seen this happen, right? So, and as I've already said, experts who are used then to lend credibility to these reports. So I think it's pretty obvious, I don't think I have to belabor, that there are an awful lot of similarities to recent developments. In recent years, we've seen how creationists have written textbooks of their own and put pressure on school districts and publishers to adopt these textbooks or to use textbooks that they consider unobjectionable, textbooks that raise the uncertainties in evolutionary biology. We've shown and we know how the tobacco industry funded so-called expert studies to prove that tobacco was not harmful and to create competing facts and narratives. And of course, in the area of climate change denial, the repeated accusation that climate scientists are socialists. Or my favorite one is when I was accused by wishful thinking. I was accused by Senator James Inhofe of being part of the liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I respond, liberals should be so organized. The NELA strategy is really the merchants of doubt strategy. It didn't begin with the tobacco industry. It's actually much older. Cast doubt upon adverse facts about your product or industry, impugn the motives and credibility of those who are making factually based claims, accuse them of being socialists and communists, and insist that it's the government that's threatening your freedom and that the private sector is actually what's preserving, protecting, and defending it. And recruit third-party allies or even create entire front organizations. So if we skip again back to the present, one of the front organizations that Eric Conway and I studied was a group called TASC, the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition. This is a group that promoted the idea that policy should be based on sound science. And who could argue against that? Who wouldn't agree that public policy should be based on sound science? Except the problem is that TASC was actually a wholly created organization, a front organization for the Philip Morris Tobacco Company. They hired a PR firm, APCO Associates, and there's a really interesting materials about this in which they actually talk about why they need to hire APCO, because their previous PR agency, Burson Marsteller, was now viewed as too obviously associated with the tobacco giant. This was launched in November 1993 with press releases and calls to journalists around the country. John Boltz, a manager of media affairs at Philip Morris, supplied APCO with a list of sympathetic journalists, but APCO, not Boltz, would place the calls, quote, to remove any possible link to PM, i.e. Philip Morris. Among TASC's activity was they created a Sound Science and Journalism Award, and the first award was granted to New York Times reporter Gina Kolata, who they said, quote, had responsibly detailed how science has been distorted and manipulated to fuel litigation on silicone breast implants. What they didn't tell you was that one of the principal funders of TASC was Dow Corning, the maker of breast implants. So let me step back now from this history and talk a little bit then about the larger problem of post-truth America. I think it's obvious from what I've shown you today, and I think most historians would say this, that post-truth isn't post at all. The term post-truth may be new, but the practices associated with it are not. What we see here is actually a century-old pattern of disinformation aimed at promoting the interests of private capital by confusing people about facts regarding their products, and by demonizing the alternatives, in part by asserting that those alternatives threaten American freedom. So what is the relationship to us, to the humanities and the Humanities Center? Well, I'm an unusual academic. I'm not competitive. I don't like having something all to myself. I like company. I like friends. I'm sociable. I would like you all to get involved in this project because I think there are some giant questions here that we have not engaged with in the way that we could and should in really profitable ways. So this is a complicated story. I've only just shown you a few little tidbits, a few details. Hopefully a couple years from now I can tell you a much richer and fuller story. But this is, even with these tidbits, we see that this is a very complex story at the nexus of science, technology, politics, economy, money, and power in both senses of the word, electrical power and political power, which have been closely linked in this country for 100 years. But humanities scholars, I think, have been a bit slow to study this and similar issues. There's very little humanities literature on tobacco, and only recently has there been much on climate change. The most famous intervention in my field, which is STS, History of Science, on creationism is the sociologist Steve Fuller. So I guess he's a sociologist, so maybe he doesn't count. But in STS, Steve Fuller, who defends creationists. NELA was the subject of a major set of federal investigations in the 1930s, 30 volumes of materials, and yet there is no recent secondary literature on it at all. I first discovered this by rereading Tom Hughes's book, Networks of Power, published in 1983, and David Nye's book, Electrifying America, published in 1990. In Hughes's book, it's a footnote. In Nye, there's a paragraph, a few sentences. But this is a story about power and values. It's not just about electricity. Many environmental issues are fundamentally issues of power and values. So you might think the humanists would be at the forefront of the analyses of these issues. As Homi said at the start of this evening, these are issues about care, about what we care about and what we should be caring for and what we're not caring for. But by and large, we haven't been at the forefront of these issues. So why have humanities scholars paid relatively little attention to these juicy and interesting and important topics? So I want to just throw out a few ideas, mainly just to provoke conversation, because I think there is a conversation that we need to have about this. And I say this in part based on my experience teaching and the way my students react to these questions. And so I call this the shadows of symmetry in postmodernism. When I first started talking about the findings that became the book Merchants of Doubts, this is now going back 10 years, I found that my historical colleagues were actually very interested, because historians are interested in power and politics, and so it wasn't a hard sell to get my colleagues, for example, in US history to be interested. But my colleagues in science studies and STS were extremely uncomfortable. And some said out loud that they thought I was violating the symmetry principle. Now, does everybody here know what that is? Or no, okay. So in science studies, one of the most influential figures in our field is David Bloor, who early on, back in the 1970s, promoted what he called the strong program in sociology of science. And he argued that good sociology of science, good STS, had to be symmetrical, by which he meant that we should treat the causes of true and false beliefs. We should look for the same kinds of causes in explaining both true and false beliefs. So we should be examining both empirical and social causes, but we should not presuppose that a true belief is caused by empirical evidence, but a false belief is caused by social interest, that we should not make that presupposition. I'll say more about that in a minute. But it wasn't just colleagues, it was students too. Even today, students who come into history of science out of STS backgrounds sometimes explicitly say that they, quote, think we're not allowed to say that the electric industry claims were false, that we're not allowed to use the word false or true, and that we're not allowed to say that public power in fact costs less than private electricity. And the phrase not allowed is a phrase I have heard in my classroom more than once, which I have to say I find extremely disturbing to think that in a great university we're not allowed to say certain things, whatever they are, but especially we're not allowed to use the word true or false or fact. So recently my student Eric Baker, who's here tonight, stand up and be counted, Eric, and I wrote an article, and I call it Truth Without Scare Quotes. The argument here is that the idea that our disciplinary commitments do not permit us to say that one side of a debate has facts, or even the weight of evidence as judged by scientific experts on its side, or to suggest that a settled scientific consensus might bear some kind of meaningful relationship to truth. More broadly, we can characterize this as a sort of reticence even to invoke cognitive categories or to discuss truth without putting the word in scare quotes. And my students who are here will know what I'm talking about. Now, I want to make a really important point here and be clear about what I'm saying. This is not an argument against symmetry as a methodological starting point. My own work is deeply influenced by David Bloor. I think his argument in Science and Social Imagery, which was first published in 1979, was an incredibly important intervention. But he was arguing that we should consider both epistemic and social factors in our analyses and not prejudge which was more pertinent in any given case. And so I already explained this. And I agree. I think that was a very important intervention and rightly influential. But I think that a good deal of science studies literature, including some canonical work, there's been a conflation of symmetry as a methodological starting point, that is to say, what is your initial assumption approaching a problem, versus an empirical endpoint. That is to say, it's one thing to say we shouldn't prejudge the case, but it's another thing to say that after doing 5 years of archival research, you couldn't come to the conclusion that the empirical evidence was largely on one side and not on the other. Yet I think that actually many of us have felt that we can't do that. I would like to argue that empirical and social causes do play a role in all belief. I think Bloor and other colleagues are correct about that. But I also want to say that it's an empirical question as to how much of a role they play in any given case. And that as historians or sociologists or philosophers or literary theorists, we could look at that question and we might learn something important if we did. Now, I think if we put it this way, it's actually obvious, but I think the shadow of symmetry has made many STS scholars have trouble, A, identifying empirical causes, and B, as taking them as ever being determinative. And that leads many to assume that scientists' claims about empirical drivers and their beliefs have to be viewed skeptically, not just as a starting point, but at all times in investigations. And if you think I'm creating a straw man, and I'm very sensitive because I hate it when academics create straw mans, I'm going to give you an example to prove that this is really happening even as we speak. So just this year, some colleagues in science studies criticized consensus studies, including my own, as taking the side of scientists, or assuming the truth value of their claims, and therefore as being illegitimate intellectually. So I want to argue that these attitudes contribute to what Stephen Colbert famously called truthiness in a good deal of literature about science. And that, of course, leads to postmodernism in general. So without getting into a big debate about postmodernism and how much it has or has not influenced larger cultural and political trends, I think it is fair to say, or at least to suggest, or at least to raise as a question, that by destabilizing notions of truth and facts, postmodernism has made it more difficult for us to talk about what is wrong with things like the Nela propaganda campaign. And I want to argue that that's problematic both empirically and morally. Empirically, because a fetishistic attachment to symmetry and certain postmodern ideals can lead us, not necessarily, but I think it often does, into an ahistorical false equivalence. And morally, because it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to make a credible case for why an industry should be held accountable for damage caused by its products. And I may be wrong about this, and if I am, and if you think there's a way to solve this, using symmetry or postmodernism, then let's have that conversation, because I think that would be great. So I just want to end with one example that I think is important and compelling, and that's the question of lead paint. I think it's fair to say that we all know that lead paint interferes with children's brain development. But if we ask the question, how do we know this? The answer has to be that we know it through the work of our scientific and public health colleagues, through the consensus of experts, our colleagues in the medical school, our colleagues in the School of Public Health, and scientists and medicine, doctors and public health officials in hospitals and medical schools and public health schools all across this country, who have weighed the available evidence and concluded that it demonstrates that when infants and young children are exposed to lead, it affects their brain development. But if we can't invoke hybrid social cognitive categories such as consensus, much less empirical categories such as evidence, then we're hamstrung in any effort to explain why we are warranted in saying that lead paint leads to brain damage in children. Now, of course, there are many other issues that are raised by the things I've talked about tonight, and I've written a talk that I hope is sort of deliberately provocative, and there are many other things we could talk about. And one of the things I haven't talked about is the problem that we don't want to be accused of bias. And of course, as academics, that's a real problem. We want to, as much as possible, weigh different points of view and not, as Bloor said, presuppose that we know that the answer to a question is one thing or another. But I will leave you with one final thought, something that the great Ashley Montagu said a long time ago: reality has a well-known liberal bias. Thank you very much. Sure. Yeah, great. Does Homie get the prerogative of the first question?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Yes, he does, as a matter of fact. I'm actually just sitting up here to keep you company.
Oh, that's nice of you.
In this crowd, I can't imagine there aren't plenty of questions to get the conversation started. Well, I just want to say thank you. I thought that was incredibly interesting and also a cautionary tale at this moment when we're searching for a new president for this great university. One of the issues that arises in many conversations is what is the relationship between the university and industry, which is a boundary that's being redrawn at many institutions and in different ways within our own institution. And so you've provided us with quite a sobering story about that relationship. So I thought that was very timely, and I thank you for that. I was also reminded of a passage that occurs early on your book on continental drift, where you talk about the tendency of historians to regard truth as contingent. You have a very pithy paragraph. I wish I could remember the exact wording. And then the tendency of scientists to want to arrive at truth, which is not linked to time and space in that localized way. Then you ask whether or not it's possible to resolve this, and in some sense you're still at this very difficult question about how we reconcile that understanding.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, I think part of the key to an academic career is to dig your teeth into juicy questions that you can live with for a long time. You know, questions that will justify, in a sense, a long marriage, right? So I think that I have come back to that question repeatedly in different ways, and that feels like a really satisfying thing to be able to do. Yeah.
No,
so
I agree with you. The great questions are not questions we then answer and move on to other things.
Right.
They're
And that's why I
questions
don't.
that push us through an entire
Right, and that's
life.
why I've never understood scientists who are, or academics who are territorial about their work. I mean, if the question is big enough, then there's room for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Homie, do you have a question?
So, Naomi, I was absolutely both terrified and entertained as today. So, really, you hit a lot of, you ticked off a lot of very good, very important boxes. And this talk was particularly sobering on a day on which I read this morning, I think in the Wall Street Journal, or I was on a plane, so I got that 46% of voters believe that Trump is being represented by the media as peddling fake news, when in fact the fakery is on the part of the media. 46%. Now, you know, polls change, but then 31% thought that Trump and a lot of his anti-regulation team, etc., were in fact, that the truth was not on their side, that they were manipulating facts, 31, and the rest were undecided. And that's a very sobering thought, and we can come back to that in any way in which you like. But what your talk made me think about was this kind of repetitive cycle of the manipulation of news, values, the manipulation of it by special interests, particularly those of free market capital, in the name of freedom and the individual. And at each time when this happens, there is a mass of evidence that this is happening. People know it, just as we do today. We know it, and yet 46% think that Trump is telling the truth and is being misrepresented by the media. So the issue here really is one of ideology as much as it is of science, as you said. But what is it about the resistance, about this repetitive resistance of the ideology of freedom, which allows people to fantasize, even if, and I'm being very biased here, to fantasize that that their freedoms are being taken away, their individual privacy is being threatened, and so on. Now, I just want to say, I don't believe, I mean, people have described me as a postmodernist ever since I was more or less born, but I'm not.
You were born postmodern.
I was born, but I am not. To condemn myself even further, I would say, if there is anything, I've been a post-structuralist, not a postmodernist. And there is a big difference between the two. But if there is one thing that a lot of the Jejune claims of postmodernism gets right, if there's one thing, and I very much oppose, there's a postmodernism of everything. There's a postmodernism of shoe production, postmodernism of movies or architecture. But if there's one thing it suggests, is that iterative processes, which are non-teleological, can raise questions about truth or reality in a contextual framework. So iteration is not about the notion of a kind of evolutionary or continuous system leading to a certain teleological notion of freedom or whatever it is. And so in that case, I would have thought that you could have harnessed certain ideas of temporality and technology and temporality and truth against those who, run the wagon straight in a kind of teleological line towards the notion of freedom. So I thought, certain concepts of postmodernism could be valuable to your inquiry and disrupt this notion of truth and linearity and teleology, in which a lot of these claims are made. But my real question is, why can't we turn, my real question is what I said earlier.
Yeah.
Why are we, when we have all the evidence, why do people still want to hold on to their ideological beliefs even when they're self-destructive? And your talk has shown that this is a cyclical process. It's not an evolutionary or teleological. And today we see this more than ever before.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really important question. And I think, in a way, that's what I'd like from this talk, like to have that conversation, because I don't know the answer to that. And I wouldn't even begin to think I could start to answer it tonight. But I think those are the kinds of questions that we really need to be talking about. And, those questions don't get asked most of the time about climate change. I mean, I've gone to hundreds of conferences about climate change in the last decade, and that question never gets asked, right? The question of why Americans can be persuaded that regulating carbon dioxide threatens their freedom, or like we say in the film, how Americans could be enrolled as allies. So here I'll use Latour, right? I mean, Americans were enrolled in allies in the defense of the interests of the tobacco industry against their own interests in public health, because they were persuaded by the argument that their freedom was somehow at stake. So it proves that it's an extremely powerful argument. And so we have to take that on board, and we have to realize that if that's what's going on, and in some ways it's too bad more of our scientific colleagues here, but this is part of what I've been trying to say to the scientific community, if that's what's going on, then no amount of charts and graphs about death, tobacco-related mortality and morbidity will solve this problem, right? Because if I think my freedom is being threatened by tobacco regulation, I'm not going to be influenced by an argument about tobacco morbidity and mortality. And it's the same with climate change. If I think that the Democrats want to tell me where I can live and where I can work and what car I can drive, I'm not going to be influenced by an argument that says, but look at the sea level rise. As sea level has risen another inch since this decade, or this rate of sea level rise has doubled, or look at the exponential growth in the rate of sea level rise in North Carolina. No, that's going to be irrelevant to me, because I believe that my freedom is being threatened. And so that's part of the point of this argument, is to say it's a category error to think that this problem can be addressed with more scientific data if what's fundamentally at stake is people's ideological commitments and their beliefs about the character of American culture. And it's linked also to not just the idea of freedom in an abstract way, but to a belief that what makes America great, what makes life in America great, is that we're a free country and that we have a level of freedom that is unmatched anywhere in the world. Whether or not that claim is true is not the relevant point. The claim is that that claim is persuasive for many people.
So I think this is an incredibly helpful way to reframe what's going on around climate change. It leads me, anyway, to think that this is a view into, in some sense, the unconscious of the problem, the sort of social unconscious of the problem. But it does make me wonder whether the iterations are exactly the same, right? Whether what's underlying the resistance to climate change really we can hang that on the same ideology of freedom. And I don't, this is really an open question about whether or not that's true, but it's a very intriguing idea. And I think the other question that's related that arises for me is the age-old question of why Americans are so suspicious of government control over their lives and not corporate control over their lives, especially now, right? I mean, really? Like it's the government that's controlling your life? It's not Facebook? It's not, so...
yeah, well, and that may change. I mean, we live in an interesting moment because people are starting to talk about the ways in which Facebook or Google have access to all this information, and your privacy is probably more threatened by them than the government because they are probably more efficient in gathering information. But just about the returning of certain themes, I mean, I always say history is neither a line nor a cycle, it's a spiral, right? So we spiral back around to certain themes, but of course they're never exactly the same. The arguments about freedom in 2017 are not going to be exactly the same as the arguments about freedom in 1937, but there are going to be certain family resemblances, right? And we do see certain words and certain motifs being recycled, and the fact that they are recycled and seem to be recycled with effect is telling us something about certain kinds of persistent patterns in American culture.
May I just throw one thing in here, please, Robin? Just one quick thing. We've been talking about freedom, but I think the issue is not freedom in general. I think there's a specific thing that's coming up, which is the freedom of choice. And I think that's a different thing from just thinking about freedom because it's so much linked to the market ideology. So I think the specific form of freedom that people always feel threatened about is freedom of choice, not freedom of movement or freedom of speech, but my choice is being somehow determined.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Jed Schwartz from Somerville. I just thank you for the reference to David Bloor. I'd never heard of him, and I'm supposedly in sociology. I just, presuming that the Wall Street Journal report about 46% favoring is correct, which I think is probably a fair assumption, but the essence of a news report is much more difficult than the rejection of the completeness of a news report. So that if you deconstruct Trump's "it's fake news" to "it's not an adequate report," that in fact is a much more, is much easier to accept, and in fact is truer than the claim that a report from a news report, any news report, is a complete and adequate depiction of what happened. I'm just trying to explain, not defend Trump, but to explain why it's actually slightly. I mean, if you change it from fake news to it's not adequate, then it makes more sense that people actually believe him because there's a skepticism about reality in the country as a whole, and that's the essence of my comment. Thanks very much.
Questions? Yeah.
I read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill last week, and I was going over my notes. And in the last section, he has one little paragraph where he talks about the Maine laws, which were...
I'm sorry, the what laws?
The Maine laws.
Maine laws.
Which evidently were about how regulations to selling liquor. And the preface to his little paragraph is, the person who is selling a product has a vested interest in your buying that product, maybe against their own interest. They want to sell more of that. And I thought that was really interesting. He doesn't elaborate on that, but that was interesting. Let me give you some references. George Seldes, in Fact, all right, from the 1930s on, talking about cigarette smoking. You know, really interesting. I think this stuff also goes back into the 1850s and John Stuart Mill talking about, talking maybe possibly about morphine, right, and opium, right, talking about liquor, lead. Thomas Midgley Jr.
Could we get a question?
Yeah, I'll finish. I just want to give you these references. Thomas Midgley Jr. and lead in gasoline, testifying before Congress while he's suffering from lead poisoning, saying there's no problem, right? What is interesting to me is for over a decade I've been saying solar is civil defense. It doesn't matter what you believe about climate change. We know that there's going to be a weather emergency, and therefore we should have a light, you know, a phone, a radio. You can do that with a couple of inches of PV panel, and you're set. So if you talk about that, you're moving towards a transition. But I say this to Michael Mann last year, climate scientist, and I say, this gets us out of the right fighting, the argument. You know, what do you think of that? And he says, no. They have to believe the science, right? So what is it about us that we would rather fight, all right, about truth and falsity rather than do something that we all know is a legitimate precaution, whatever we believe about climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I can't speak for Mike Mann, but I will say the following about our scientific colleagues, and I think I can say this because I used to be one of them, or still am in some ways. When you're raised as a scientist, you're raised to believe that knowledge is power, right? Goes back to Bacon. And that idea is so deeply ingrained that to accept that it might not be, to accept that you might do the greatest, best, you know, most elegant, most powerful scientific analysis in the world, and people would just say to you, I don't believe it. The cognitive dissonance created by that is so profound that I don't think most scientists can bear it. Because if you really come to grips with it, your whole world potentially collapses, because then, well, why are you working so hard? And it's hard, you know, being a scientist. I mean, those of us in the humanities and social sciences, we can moan and groan about how, you know, we don't get paid as much or we don't get loved as much. But the reality is our scientific colleagues work unbelievably hard and spend a lot of time hustling for money. You know, why are you doing all that if you don't believe in your heart that the knowledge that you produce will be used by people in meaningful and effective ways? And when you see the evidence of the way in which that doesn't happen, I think if you come to grips with it, it's kind of crushing, actually. So I think many scientists don't come to grips with it. And even people I know well, people I consider friends, people who I consider sophisticated, will still say things to me at the end of the day like, well, but I still believe, you know, at the end of the day, you know, society will have to act on this. We'll have, you know, people will have to accept this. And, you know, I want that to be true. But as a historian, I don't believe it is. As a historian, I think, you know, this could go either way. It could be that people accept it and we, you know, convert our energy system. And it could be we don't, and we have the collapse of Western civilization scenario. And that's partly why I wrote that book, because I wanted people to see what it looked like if you took seriously the possibility that we completely fail to act on what we know. And so that's the motif of the book, the historian of the future who is asking the question, how is it possible they did so much and did so little?
Other questions? Yeah.
This gal over here has been waiting for a while, too, so
sorry.
you might next time come to her. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, we've spoken a lot about the role of the scientist in the process of kind of media production of what is truth. Could you speak a little bit about how you might have encountered the artist, so to speak, in your historical research? And in addition to that, what role you think art might play in navigating post-truth politics?
Well, I want to start by saying I think art has a huge role to play. It's one of the few areas I'm optimistic about. And I know I saw Carson Kreitler was here earlier, and it looks like she's left, but she's writing a play right now about climate change. And she did a reading with actors yesterday that I went to, and it was so exciting and thrilling. So I hope that if her play gets produced at ART, you all go and see it. I think it's incredibly important because I think it's one of the places where we are able to actually think through questions in ways that can get us out of the boxes that we walked in with, right? And good art, when it's effective, reaches people in part because it frames a question in a different way than we thought about it before, or it suggests different possibilities. And one of the things that's so difficult about climate change, I mean, lots of people these days have been quoting Frederick Jameson, right? We can imagine the end of the world more easily than we can imagine the end of capitalism. And the crazy thing about it is that I think he's right.
Yeah.
I mean, he's right. And it's true of me. When I was writing The Collapse of Western Civilization, it was actually quite easy to sort of imagine how this whole thing just goes to hell in a handbasket. But then when you start to think about how we could do something different, which is what I'm working on now with my postdoc, Jeffrey Supran, who was here earlier, oh, it's so much harder. I mean, so much harder. And I don't know why that is, but it is. But then if you think about art and creative work, I mean, what is it that art does? Well, one of the things it does, right, is to help us imagine things that we didn't previously imagine. So I think it's hugely important. And so if you're an artist, or if you're thinking about being an artist, or if you know artists, you know, I am, like, that's where I'm pinning some of my hopes now. That might be a lot of pressure, because I really don't think the solution, well, I don't want to say this. I think there's a lot of possible ways in which things can also go well, and I don't give up hope that there could be, I mean, I am very optimistic about batteries. You know, like, I'm not saying that technological solutions won't play an important role. I think they will. But I don't think that more scientific information is going to be determinative at this point in history.
Yeah.
I'm Kitty Beer. I write novels about climate change. So I'm that kind of artist. I was intrigued by your phrase, social subconscious, because all during the conversation about why Americans are doing this, you haven't talked about the rest of the world where it's much less of a problem to be obsessed with personal freedom. So this is a kind of psychosis. And I'm wondering if, of all the other scientists you want to bring into this discussion, where are the psychiatrists? Our culture needs to be psychoanalyzed. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. So first of all, part of the way I got involved in this whole thing in the first place was about 10 years ago, I was doing a project with a group of colleagues in England. It was an international group, but it was based at London School of Economics. And I was flying to London pretty regularly, going like 2 or 3 times a year. And you'd get off the airplane in Heathrow, and there were these big, giant signs that said BP, Beyond Petroleum. And it was like going to a parallel universe. Yeah. You know, it was like literally living in a different world. And my friends in Europe would say to me, what is wrong with America? Like, what the heck is going on there? And so part of this project became a project to try to understand why the United States was viewing this question in such a different way than really any other country in the world. I mean, there's no other country. I mean, Australia had some problems. Canada was a bit bad under the Harper government. But really, there isn't any country in the world where, like, people reject the evidence of climate change the way we do here in the United States. So that was part of the problem, was to try to understand this. And again, that's what brings me back to the idea that this is essentially a humanistic and social scientific question, right? This is a question why Americans reject climate science, right? And that's not a question that climate scientists can answer. That's a question that social scientists and humanists and artists might be able to answer, and maybe psychiatrists, right? So in terms of psychiatry, I'm not one, but some of my best friends are. Robert J. Lifton has a new book that's just come out on exactly this issue, so if you haven't read it, it's a must-read.
He's coming to
Good.
speak.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Excellent. I think his work is really important. And there have been others, too. I mean, there's a group of psychiatrists who have been having this discussion now about Donald Trump, mostly in relation to the nuclear weapons. Eric Chivian, our colleague, had a letter in the New York Times the other day. But I know that he's also thinking about climate change. So I think there are people. But, you know, it's a tricky thing, right? Because, you know, psychiatrists don't want to psychoanalyze individual people. But then, you know, group psychology, well, that's a real thing. So, I mean, I do think there are things to be done there. It's not my field, but I do think it's important. The other thing I was going to say is Amitav Ghosh's recent book, A Great Derangement. I mean, I love that book, and I think it's such a great title because he's right. There's a way in which this is deranged. We're destroying our homes. We're burning down our houses. And if you went home tonight and set your house on fire, you would be considered crazy, right? And you would probably be, your family or friends, if you had family and friends, would, try to get you psychiatric help. And if you didn't have family and friends, you might be arrested as an arsonist. But you would be considered a mentally unstable person. So we're burning down our house. And yet somehow that's normal, right? So I think that thinking of it as a kind of derangement is actually a very powerful way of getting at some of these questions about why we're doing the things we're doing and why we seem to be locked into certain patterns of behavior, certain patterns of economic activity, and we can't imagine an alternative.
Yeah.
So I have two questions. Do we need to enlighten the masses, or do we need to properly propagandize the masses?
Good question. Well, that's a really good question, and I guess...
and is there a difference?
And is there a difference? I guess I'd like to argue for something like true propaganda. I mean, obviously, part of the reason this works is because Neela told the story about a threat to things that people valued, right? That slide that I showed more than once deliberately of the cute little boy looks a little bit like JFK Jr., right, with these things. The message is these are things you care about, your children, your freedom of religion, and these things are threatened. And that's a story, it's a narrative, and it was a powerful one that we have evidence was influential, at least to some degree. So, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this in the climate change community, right? The climate scientists don't have a narrative. They have facts, they have figures, but they don't have a story about why this matters. So to the extent that one can tell a true story about why this matters, why things you care about are threatened, because that's the truth, right? I mean, the Neela story about the threats to freedom could be flipped on its head. There's a story about things we care about and things we love that are threatened by climate change. But climate scientists never talk about love, right? I think the day I knew I was going to be a historian was the day that I said in a seminar, why don't we ever talk about love? And it was like you could have heard a pin drop in the room, right? So, but I mean, I became a geologist because I loved rocks. That's the honest to God truth of the matter. And I love being outdoors, and I love that sense of being connected to the natural world, and that sense of feeling that I actually understood something really deep and profound, that I felt a sense of emotional connection to geological time. Those were all very emotional things for me. But scientists never talk about that because that's considered at odds with models of scientific rationality. But that stands in the way of communication, because if you talk to anyone in communication, anyone in marketing, and anyone in advertisement, anyone in Hollywood, they will all tell you communication isn't about the facts, it's about, right? It's about getting people here or here, right? It's about what you feel in the gut. And if you see a movie that's powerful, it's because it moves you emotionally, not because somebody made a good argument, right? So I think that's part of the challenge. So I guess my answer to you is, I think we do need to tell stories, but I don't think we have to lie. I don't think we have to make up BS, because the facts, the truth are bad enough, right? Because I get asked that question too, like, should scientists be more alarmist? Like, we don't need to be more alarmist. The truth is alarming enough. So just stick with the truth, but tell it in a way that is compelling and that connects it to the things that people care about.
Yeah. Let's take a couple more questions.
So two other kind of prominent instances of science denial that I can really think of off the top of my head are maybe vaccines and GMOs, which maybe you have arguments of freedom, but from a kind of against corporate interests. So I was wondering if you've looked into the history of those and how those kind of instances come about and are different from the climate problem or similar.
Yeah, I haven't done that much research on them, but I've certainly read the work of my colleagues who've worked on them. So first of all, I want to say on GMOs are not a case of science denial. That's what Monsanto wants you to think. But the reality is that GMOs raise a lot of complicated issues. One issue is whether or not they're safe to eat, and that is a scientific question. And we do have a fair amount of scientific evidence that suggests that probably, for most people in most cases, they're probably safe to eat, although I think one could still raise some questions about that. And I don't think we have really good data to identify some people for whom they might not be safe. But overall, the scientific evidence does say that they're probably safe for most people to eat. So if you were to say GMOs are not safe to eat, that would be science denial. But there are a lot of people who are opposed to GMOs for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with food safety. And the GMO industry, Monsanto, have been trying to collapse this all down to food safety in order to claim that it's a case of science denial and discredit other kinds of issues that are being raised about GMO. So my favorite example is if you read the papal encyclical on climate change, Pope Francis is against genetically modified crops. It has nothing to do with food safety. It has nothing to do with science at all. It's not a scientific question. It's a theological argument. You might agree with it, you might disagree with it, you might like it, you might think it's stupid, but it's not science denial. So I think that's really important to be clear about. Vaccine rejection is science denial in my opinion. The best book on that is our colleague Seth Mnookin at MIT, who wrote this book, The Panic Virus, which is a really great, sensitive investigation of the families of people whose children have autism and who believe that their autism was caused by vaccinations. So really, really worth reading. It's kind of a model of how you can be sensitive to the concerns and experiences of people without necessarily going native and accepting their accounts of what's happened to them. So I highly recommend that book. But here's the really interesting thing about vaccine rejection. I think rejection is probably a better word than denial. Even though vaccine rejection is a real phenomenon in the United States and it's having public health consequences, it's still actually pretty mild. It's pretty moderate. There's only about 5% of Americans that don't get their children vaccinated. Now, from a public health perspective, that's problematic because once you get down to about 90% vaccination rates, you begin to lose herd immunity and people are at risk. So 5 to 10% of vaccine rejection is a serious public health issue, but it still means that 90 to 95% of Americans are getting their vaccinations. So that's wildly different than climate change, where something like, maybe 40 or 50% of us are rejecting the scientific findings, or creationism, where depending on how you ask the question, anywhere from 50 to 95% of Americans have views that are at odds with what evolutionary biologists think is correct. So it's a really, really different kind of case. And now add one more piece to it. So in the case of vaccinations, you have the industry is aligned with science and public health. But imagine if that weren't the case. Imagine if industry were on the side of saying that vaccines cause autism. In my opinion, then we wouldn't just have 5% of Americans rejecting it. Then in my opinion, we would have a public health crisis of colossal proportions. So part of the lesson of this whole story is you have to look at the alignments, right? You have to look at what are the political alignments, what are the economic alignments, where is power lining up? The fossil fuel industry is incredibly powerful. And that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why doubt and disinformation about climate change persists, because you have very, very powerful corporations spending lots and lots of money to keep those arguments alive. Now, creationism is a bit different. There isn't a kind of creationist industry, but there are some powerful, yeah, I know exactly, I knew kind of, right. There isn't a kind of private sector creationism in quite the same way that we have private sector fossil fuel, but there is a kind of industry. There's certainly a big social movement. So it's a kind of different set of alignments. They're more social alignments, I would say. Convery is nodding, so okay, good. But the point is, though, that's, if you really want to understand any of these issues, they're not all the same. They're not all just, oh, people reject science. There are more complicated dynamics going on. And so I think it's not necessarily helpful to lump them all together. I'll just give one other example of this. I did give a talk recently where I talked a little bit about GMOs, and I used this example. National Geographic magazine about a couple of years ago had a cover story some of you may have seen, which they called The War on Science. I'm not personally fond of warfare metaphors, so I didn't really love that to begin with. But then they had a list of claims, and the claims were climate change is not real, evolution didn't happen, vaccines cause autism, GMOs are evil. And I'm like, what? This is like, Big Bird singing which of these things doesn't belong, right? I mean, GMOs are evil is a moral claim. Might be true, might be false. But it's not a scientific question, right? But yet it's being conflated by National Geographic magazine, who you would have thought would know better, right?
Good question. Yeah. Ian.
Thank you, Naomi. The talk was convincing, eloquent, exciting. and a lot of fun. I never thought about hats in that way before.
There you go.
So I'm convinced that the kind of eloquent statements about the role of capitalism and enterprise capitalism in particular, I find that very convincing, and the invocation of the papal encyclical points me to one way to explore the historical particularity of this, and this isn't my question, so it's a prompt to further thought, and that is if both of these examples are inherent to a capitalist moment and a particular expression of an American capitalism, then what happens if we push earlier, when we get into debates over heterodoxy and orthodoxy in the papacy, for example? Do we see similar techniques being put to work, or is there something inherent to this moment and this culture, and how has that come up in your thinking? And if it hasn't, then perhaps this is something we could think with our colleagues in the Divinity School about as we move ahead. My question, though, has to do with less with capitalism, more with energy. So Lenin famously said, communism equals Soviet power plus electricity.
Yeah.
It's the apotheosis
Right.
of his project. And so that led me to think, okay, we've got to think differently about capitalism here, or what's going on with the electrical stuff.
Yeah.
And that's my question, and it's quite open. I'm interested in hearing you think out loud about what's particular about the electricity here, or if that's too narrow, then it strikes me that 2 of our 4 main examples are energy questions: fossil fuels and climate change, electricity, and doubt, and the freedom of the market. And so why fully 50% of these examples are coming out of a key sector of the economy? And that's what I'm interested in hearing about. What about the energy? What about electricity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer. And like I said, this is early stages, so this is really great to have this feedback. It's something I've thought about, but I don't know what the answer is. But what is it about electricity, right? Because there's a whole set of ideologies around electricity, right? And that quotation is such a great one, right? This idea that electricity is so uniquely powerful that if you can harness it, you can do all kinds of things. You can make the Soviet, the communist utopia, but you could also make the rural American utopia as well, right? I mean, isn't that amazing? Both Gifford Pinchot and Lenin think that their problems can be solved through electricity. And so in class today, my technology seminar, we had a whole discussion today about technological determinism. And this gets to this really tricky question in history, right? So as historians, we don't like determinism. We think everything in life is complicated, which it is. But yet there is something about certain technologies that seemingly make people think that there's something inherently or innately powerful about them. And I think you see this today in a lot of the discussion around computers and AI as well, right? But you see this in electricity so powerfully, and even the word power, right? The way the word power means both the fuel, the electricity, the fossil fuel, the coal, but also the political power. And is it a coincidence that we use the same word for both? That would be worth doing some investigation. When did the word power come to mean what we got out of burning fossil fuels, right? No, it's way before the 1970s. I want to say it might be the 1870s, but it might be the 1770s. I don't know. But I mean, this would be a useful thing to think about. But electrical power, energy, thermodynamic power is very closely linked with concepts of cultural and political power as well. And you see this in the Industrial Revolution as well. And this is where I'm getting way outside my field, right? But, when people are talking about the power of coal, when people are talking about railroads, when people are talking about electrification, these motifs come back about how these things are going to be transformative, right? And even the word transformer, right? So, I mean, the analogies, the language. So I think I need to do a lot more work on that, and I hope we can think through this together, because I think it's really important, and maybe if we could crack that, we could also crack some of these questions about why people view technology as being so determinative.
Well, and one would want to think about whether energy is really the key point of kinship in those examples, or whether it's the interdependence and the networking that's involved in both examples. Because if there's one thing that's challenging to American ideology around capitalism, it's It's that your choice affects other people's in ways that should then rebound to have effects on your capacity to choose. Whether it's burning fossil fuels or whether it's an electrical grid.
Right. Well, that's like the famous Isaiah Berlin line about, freedom for wolves is death to sheep. And I used that line once when I was talking at the Yellowstone Coalition, and I thought, oh, bad metaphor here, right? But I think that's true. But I also think there's just this other thing about, the notion of the natural monopoly. Like, that's a really interesting phrase too, right? Monopolies are supposed to be bad in enterprise capitalism. So, but yet we have these things like electricity and railroads and telephone and telegraph that don't seem to work well in a free enterprise system. So what do? You say they're natural monopolies. So somehow you separate them out. It's natural for that to be a monopoly, so therefore you allow it to be a monopoly, but then you immediately have the problem of regulation. Because once you allow it to be a monopoly, then it has to be regulated. But people don't like regulation, so then you get, the corruption of regulatory agencies, and on it goes.
We'll take one last question.
Thanks for your talk, Naomi. I'll offer a really quick and preliminary suggestion as to the origins of the power question.
Oh, good. Yes, excellent.
Basically, horsepower. Once we start using it as a unit to sort of measure the capacity of our sort of steam machines and the like. But my question goes to sort of the origins of this project and what you presented earlier. You said that you were really interested in sort of how did these people, this cast of characters in Merchants of Doubt, for instance, sleep at night and try to sort of humanize them in a way. And it seems as if your presentation of Neela here, it's almost like, I don't know, Cobra and G.I. Joe. It's just so like nefarious. And I'm wondering whether, as you've sort of done your research, and I know you're at the early stages of this, how your understanding of this new cast of characters may be sort of different from the one that you had sort of presented in your earlier work, and maybe as a way of then sort of getting to sort of, with the ones in Giant Power here, do these people really believe in this kind of freedom that they sell? So instead of a sort of Merchants of Doubt, whether this is sort of proselytizers of freedom or sort of who actually sort of, and I know it's difficult to get to the question of intention, but to the extent that you've been able to see in your sources.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's too soon to tell. I don't have the source material yet to start getting into that. I think when I get into some of the archives, particularly in the universities that worked with these people, we may be able to see a little bit better what some of the sort of justifications, understandings are, and begin to, complexify the story a little bit and make them not so black and white. Right now, I don't have the material to do that yet. But I think the other thing also, if I think about how I think about it so far, and this, as I said, is early days, but I do see Neela as being more like the tobacco industry than like Bill Nierenberg and Fred Singer, you know what I mean? One of the things that's interesting about the story is, so the entry into the Merchants of Doubt story was a group of men, people, 4 individuals, 3 of whom I knew personally. So that's the other thing. There's like a kind of very weird backstory to this whole thing about that I actually knew these people, and when I started realizing what they were up to, I thought, what in the heck are they doing? And then there was this sort of weird, almost like destiny feeling, even though I don't really believe in destiny. Like I had come across this story. I had met Eric, and he had this whole parallel story about the ozone hole. And then we looked at who these people were, and he sent me these documents that he had found in the archives at Scripps, which is where I was working. And these were all people I knew. And right at the beginning, Eric sent me a pile of materials that he had pulled out of the archive that he hadn't really done anything with. And in fact, it's kind of an ironic story. He was writing a book on the history of atmospheric science at NASA. And so he was writing about the science, not about the politics. And so he had come across this whole story about these attacks on the scientists who had worked on the ozone science. And he had set it aside because it was this sort of political story that wasn't part of his science story. And so when I met him, we started talking. He said, oh yeah, I have all this stuff about how Sherry Rowland was attacked by these guys. I'll send it to you. And so he sends me this stuff, and I open this envelope, and I open the folder, and the first page is a letter on Dartmouth letterhead. Now, my first job was at Dartmouth, and if you've ever seen the Dartmouth letterhead, you never forget it, because it's a picture of Native Americans walking out of the woods and being enlightened by the rays of knowledge that are descending down from the heavens on these savages. It's very distinctive. And I saw this, I thought, Dartmouth. I thought, who at Dartmouth is doing this? And then I look at the letter, who's signing it, it's Bob Jastrow, and he was my colleague in my first job in the Earth Science Department at Dartmouth. So it was kind of personal for me. And the weird thing about Jastrow, two weird things. So Jastrow was sort of persona non grata in my department at the time because he was a creationist. But he was an old Earth creationist, not a young Earth creationist. But it was a little bit of an anomaly. So this is an Earth Science Department, and we've got this guy in our midst who's a creationist. And he was a very opinionated person, not the best colleague in the world. But I thought it was super interesting. And remember, I'm coming as this sort of hybrid geologist, historian of science. So I arrive, and I'm so young, and I'm so naive. And I think it's super interesting that we have this creationist in our midst. So I befriended him, and I started talking to him and asking him questions about his beliefs. And he starts telling me what he believes. And it's like straight out of William Paley and 19th century natural theology. And I think to myself, this is fantastic. This guy is a living fossil. So I spent a lot of time talking about his views. So I knew him kind of well. And then he retired. He retired a year after I got there, so we only overlapped for a year. And I knew that he had very conservative political views. He was sort of associated with Dartmouth Review. But I didn't really know very much about that. But then, so now it's 15 years later, and this is Bob Jastrow. So he's not just a living fossil, right? He's also involved in these weird attacks on science. And so, one thing kind of led to another. And so those men were always real people for me, right from the get-go. So that, in a way, helped not to tell the story as a kind of black hat, white hat story. But as we dug in the archives and we began to study their connections with the tobacco industry and then connected to the literature on the history of tobacco, like what Alan Brandt and Robert Proctor and others have done, then you read these things, you read these tobacco industry executives. If I had had more time, I was going to throw in the clip that shows the guys testifying in Congress saying, nicotine is not addictive, right? But, and then you think, okay, how do these guys sleep at night, right? Because they know they're selling a product that is deadly and addictive, and they testify under oath that it's not addictive. So, I mean, these guys are criminals, right? And there are criminals in the world, right? Just like there are conspiracies. So then the historical task gets to be, how can you tell a story about people who might actually be criminals or who might do criminal things but still maintain a kind of, historical nuance, I guess would be the right way of putting it. And in the tobacco story, one of the things that makes that easier to do is the fact that these guys were, in fact, prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice. So they are criminals, and I can say that they're criminals as a matter of fact, as opposed to as a matter of moral judgment. So part of the challenge of NELA is then going to have to be go back, and that's why I made the point about what they did wasn't criminal at the time because there were no laws against it, but in 1935 a law was passed that did make those kinds of activities criminal.
So the mention of William Paley made me look at my watch, which I noticed is a highly designed mechanism. But thank you so much. I know you taught just before this, so we're so grateful for you coming and doing this, Naomi. It's a fabulous talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you.